Welcome to this edition of Rattling the Bars. I'm Mansa Musa, co-hosting with Eddie Conway. Today, we have an extraordinary guest. We have Chris Hedges, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief in the Middle East and the Balkans for 15 years. His body of work is endless in a lot of regard. A Master of Divinity at Harvard University, and I'm just scratching the surface. He wrote a book entitled Our Class: Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. We'll be discussing this book, among other things, today. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Let's start by looking at some of the things that you say in your book. You ventured into Rahway Prison, maximum security prison, September the 5th of 2013, and you said in your book that this was a calling. Explain that.
Well, I had gone to Harvard Divinity School, but I lived in Roxbury, which is a depressed urban area in Boston, and ran a small church because I wanted to be an inner city minister. And I eventually left Divinity School to become a journalist, but I did spend 2.5 years in the inner city, which, as somebody who grew up white, middle class, was perhaps the most formative experience in my life, because it taught me how the interlocking systems of institutional racism and how they work. The probation officers, the courts, the police, the schools, the banks, they all work in concert to keep the poor poor. But you don't really see it until you live inside what Malcolm X called one of these internal colonies. I was overseas for 20 years. I came back. My neighbor, who was the head of the history department at the College of New Jersey, this was before Rutgers had a college program, was teaching semester-long courses, because after people got their GEDs, there wasn't anything for them to continue their education. So she would teach like a history course, the same kind of course she taught at the College of New Jersey. It didn't have any academic validity, but if the students finished the course, she would print up on her home computer a certificate. It would go in their file. When they went before the parole board, it would show positive activity that they had done while they were incarcerated. So I began there, and then in 2013, Rutgers began a degree program, which has been quite successful. Originally an associate's degree, now a full BA degree, and I started teaching there. But it was returning to my original calling, in the sense that I went back to that community that I had worked with and thought I was going to spend most of my life working with as a minister. And so it was a kind of return. You know, they say life's not a line, it's a circle.
Okay, and let's look at the book in and of itself, Our Class. This book, Our Class: Trauma and the Transformation in American Prison, it has a unique way of unpacking the trauma that most of us go through from mass incarceration, but more importantly, in terms of using drama to get the men to unpack traumatic experience. Talk about that. How did you come up with this concept? Because as I said, in and of itself, I was locked up 48 years in the Maryland prison system. So I'm real familiar with prison activity, and we sponsor a lot of activities. But this particular concept and the way you utilize it to get men to go into areas that was a lot of times hard to address or unpack. How was you able to come up with this particular approach?
It was completely accidental. That's probably why it worked. It wasn't premeditated. So I was teaching a course on drama. Well, not surprisingly, most people in the class, had 28 students, had no firsthand experience with drama because they don't have $150 to go buy a ticket to see something in New York. And so I decided, because drama, everything is conveyed primarily through dialogue, although, of course, great actors bring a lot to that, but primarily through dialogue. And so just on a whim, I said, well, why don't you write scenes from your own life, but in dialogue, in dramatic dialogue, so that they could become familiar with the form of drama. Well, what I didn't know is that it had gotten around inside the prison that I was a writer one of my students actually was quite familiar with my work, and he had recruited the best writers in the prison. And as you know, there are always within a prison a group of people who take writing very seriously. My students, they turn their cells into libraries. But I had about a half dozen extremely gifted writers. So when they wrote those scenes, I brought them home. My wife is an actor, and it showed her those scenes. Well, and after 2-3 weeks, the quality was still so exemplary that I decided that I would help them write a play. Well, again, I didn't understand what I was doing because, as you know, in a prison, you don't ask what people are in for. People don't even use their legal names in prison. You have to build those emotional walls because any sign of weakness, any sign of fear, any sign of vulnerability, even sensitivity makes you prey, can make you prey because for predators in prison. So you keep those walls up. And by getting them to write out of their own life, of course, what they were doing is dredging up these traumatic emotional experiences, both inside and outside prison, that many had never spoken about ever, even though they may have been in a cell with somebody for years. They'd never mentioned it. I mean, just one example, one of my students, I said, we were trying to work on a scene with a mother. My job was to kind of paste everything together. And I said, well, write just a dialogue with your mother. And at the end of the class, one of the students came up and said, well, what if we're a product of rape? And I said, well, that's what you have to write. So he writes, what he writes is the phone call that he makes from the county after he's picked up. He's from Patterson. He's picked up in a car with his half-brother. There's a gun in the car. If somebody doesn't claim it, then everybody's going to get a weapons charge. He says it's his gun. It wasn't his gun. It was his half-brother's gun. But the conversation with his mother is, it doesn't matter, Ma. I was never supposed to be here anyway, and you have the son you love. He went to prison to essentially give his mother the son she loved. I mean, this was, and of course, it was deeply emotional. And but that's what happened. That these inadvertently, these walls kind of crumbled in that process, and there were things that people wrote that they couldn't, it was so emotional they couldn't even read it. And it created a kind of bonding in that classroom, which to this day, I mean, that was 2013. I'm at the gate when these guys get out. I have, continued relationships with them. They have relationships in the prison that are different from other relationships because essentially, within that classroom setting through the process of writing that play, which was eventually published and eventually performed by the professional theater in Trenton, was sold out every night, was called Caged. They told the truth about their lives, their experiences that just doesn't get heard within a prison setting, very, very, very rarely.
And that brings me to my next question, because, as you eloquently expressed how through this writing, they was given this opportunity. I know from experience that a lot of us that come into prison, a lot of us are illiterate. A lot of us don't have the ability to articulate ourselves in a literary capacity. But in this case, one, you got the best writers, but more importantly, you, in exposing them to writing, did you sense that they had some minimum to talk about, and that this writing would give them the outlet to convey what they verbally normally convey amongst themselves in private? We talk a lot amongst ourselves, but did you sense that at some point, did you sense that this writing, that this mechanism right here was going to allow you to be able to get them to be more comfortable with what they were saying, and more importantly, to change their thinking about themselves and the world around them?
I don't know how much I changed their thinking. It was more that I allowed those interior thoughts through that process to be expressed. I mean, you have to remember, these are highly educated people. Several students in that class went on to graduate summa cum laude from Rutgers University. So they had done a lot of thinking themselves and a lot of self-reflection. But here it came out and it was expressed. and pain, the pain that they carried. It was interesting how many of the students in the class, because they're big guys, a lot of them, they all lift weights. They call it the 400 club because they all bench over 400. But they all often talked about bullying. It was a very common experience within the classroom. As children, they had been bullied. So just all sorts of pain that they had endured, loss, grief, that struggle to hold together a family. Was the whole plot line of the play was based on a true story about a guy who'd been picked up for a crime he didn't commit. He was the sole worker in the family, so he took care of the mother who had cancer and 16-year-old brother. Well, of course, he goes into prison and the world collapses. His mother dies. His brother gets evicted, ends up on the streets, and he starts to hustle to get money, to get a lawyer for his brother. And this is his lawyer called it a Haley's Comet experience. He actually got his conviction overturned eventually after a few years, but the world had been disintegrated because of that. And that was kind of the plot line of the play. So these people, they're removed from their communities, they're removed from their children, they're removed from their families. They're powerless in many ways to try and help. I mean, they try and be fathers over the phone, but there's a lot of anger that is expressed by the children, and then they stop coming. As you know, they always say after about 5 years, then the visits get scarcer and scarcer. And there are many cases I had with students who simply told, because it's a humiliating process to go through a visit. The guards will treat the families, even the children, not much better than the prisoners. And a lot of people just say, don't visit, especially to their mothers. The relationships disintegrate, the marriages. I had students who are paralegals who wrote essentially the divorces for their wives. And we forget about all of that and what that does to people on the inside, but also what that does, because prison affects not only those who are inside, but those who are outside in innumerable ways, not least of which is financial, because prisons are completely predatory. So it's Global Tellink and Armark and JPay and the commissary. Everything is privatized. Plus, you got fines. I mean, it's just you're extracting money from the poorest of the poor. It's modern day slavery. Prisons are basically plantations. They're run like plantations. Even to the way I was once at an event and I watched the warden, who'd been a guard in this prison, come up, and I just watched all my students flatter him. I mean, he was even blushing. And I said to them afterwards, I said, because I know what they think of him and what they, and it reminded me exactly of what W.E.B. Du Bois would write about, that kind of double consciousness, that if you're Black in a situation like that, you've got to understand the white world and understand your own world. But of course, that white hierarchy doesn't understand the Black world at all, even though they're in physical, close proximity to it. But there was a perfect example of, they hate the warden, obviously, but they realized within that power structure, because he had total power in the same way that plantation owner has total power, they had to flatter him in such a way, which became a kind of form of manipulation, obviously. All of those things were captured in the play, including the prison code. So you have a kind of formal code. If somebody dishonors you or disrespects you, you're supposed to respond. But as my students said, that code is, in fact, more often violated than followed. The way they put it is, you may have somebody come in who did somebody to a member of your family, and the code may say that you have to seek revenge, but in their words, you're a phantom and he's a phantom, and you walk by. I mean, prison is a complex subculture, which obviously better than I do, but all of that got wrapped into this amazing play.
Let's dial down on. Let's talk about how you was able to and how long. First of all, how long was this process?
4 months.
Okay, so let's talk about how was you able to get them to maintain the mission on this emotional roller coaster? Because as you spoke, the one person said, well, your father was in this cell, or another person that is prepared to follow the code and do something. And at the same token, it's talked out of it, or the different things that goes on in the conversation that you. How was you able to get them to like stay focused on the mission in the midst of this emotional roller? Because remember, I know for a fact I've been in this environment that I go on a diatribe. You know, something come up in my head, and you saying like, okay, read what you wrote, and then at some point I go into a diatribe, like, you know. And how was you able to get around those type of situations and get everybody to stay focused on the mission?
Right. Well, that was my job. I was the editor. So I would take the 28 scenes and I added another class. So we're meeting twice a week. You can sign students up for remedial help according to the prison. So I just signed all 28 students up for remedial help and got them for another day. But I would, cobble it together, sometimes taking parts of one scene with another scene. I went back to the class and read it to them. They had to approve it. They were reticent at first, people coming in from the outside, especially if you're white. There is that, they don't like do-gooders. They don't really want to, they're not, is that kind of exoticism people feel towards prisoners, like visiting animals in a zoo. I mean, they were aware of all that stuff. So they're careful. I mean, they have good antennas. There's a chapter called Antennas. And I know as a war correspondent, you need a good antenna just to survive. And if you don't have it, you don't survive. That was true in war. It's also true in prison, also true for their experiences on the street, which were violent and dangerous. So they have highly developed antennas to sense people out. And so they watched me at first, and they kept their distance. But I don't pretend to be anything that I'm not. I don't pretend to understand where they come from. I'm always completely honest. And I don't go in there in any way pretend I'm hip, which would be a catastrophic disaster. I actually wear a suit. I wear a suit just as I've taught at Princeton and Columbia, just as I would at Princeton or Columbia. And I expect the same decorum and the same level, academic level, which I get, as I would for students at Princeton, Columbia, NYU, or any other school I've taught at. I think that there was that sense that I was honest and I was real and I do care, and then it was watching other students make that first emotional step that gave them the space to make it. I mean, we were reading plays. We were reading August Wilson and Amiri Baraka and James Baldwin, so I had to teach the play. But people would get really restless if I didn't keep room at the end for them, because they all wanted to get up. They would get up in front of the class and read it. It was very moving. And then everyone would applaud. And they all wanted, with some exceptions when it was just too emotional, they all wanted to read what they'd done. And so the force was built in, it wasn't built by me necessarily, it was built within the class, that they decided to take those emotional steps, that had the courage to be vulnerable, and a few people stepped out first, and then the rest followed.
And I want to venture in that area a little bit more, because the safe space, that's what you hear this term a lot in reentry community and even in prison. Like I was in Supermax, and one of the tiers I was on, they had a lot of guys had a lot of open charges, so you couldn't come on that tier unless somebody sanctioned you to come on that tier, creating a safe space. In other words, making sure that the person that came on that tier would not go back and write the state's attorney and say, "Oh, I heard." So when did you realize, or when did you recognize that you had actually, that through this process, you had created a safe space? Because you don't have no safe space, then you're going to get a lot of storytelling, and it's going to be a lot of fabrication, and you're not going to get what you really want. And that's the men to open up and talk about traumatic events in their lives and be able to process that information.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the students tried to write not out of their own experience, but like out of a television script, like The Wire or something, or I don't know what you thought of The Wire. I couldn't watch it. I just thought it was romanticized crap, but it's very popular. Maybe.
Amen.
Okay. Okay. Wasn't real for me. Anyway, but they would try and write like that, or they'd write out of some gangster film or something. But I could smell it, even though I don't know the street, I could just smell that it wasn't real. And obviously, in any well-run prison has figures. I'm talking about prisoners who are leaders and respected, not only by the other prisoners, but by the administration and the guards as well. And they're the kind of interlocutors. They're the people the guards will go to. They're honest. They may be the tier rep. I don't know, but they have a status within. I had 3 guys like that in the prison. I mean, really, one of them was the head of the Muslim community, and they were really serious guys. And they were the ones they sat in the back row and they watched me the closest. But when they stepped forward, then I think it opened the door for everyone else. And they would call out that kind of writing because it wasn't real. It was like, it was that. I like Tupac a lot. I think he's amazing, but it was, but again, it was that romanticizing gangster life. And that's why the play is real, because they made sure it was real. I was teaching at the Supermax prison in Trenton, and one of my students gave me this story he'd written about, driving a Lexus and drinking Cristal champagne, all this kind of stuff. And he made his money robbing other drug dealers. A whole group of people will rob. I've had students who are big drug dealers. They say, I don't even empty my garbage unless I got a gun, which isn't for the cops. It's because they know there's a group of people who know he's got drugs and know he's got money, and they'll take it from him. And so I gave it to one of my students, Boris, who was out by then. He said, you go back and tell him that he never made a dime. And I went back, gave it to him. I said, well, I don't know anything about it. And the guy looked, he goes, yeah, it's true. So we had to shatter, because mass media is so powerful. It creates these images that are unreal. And that was shattered, not so much by me, because I don't have the expertise to do it, but by other people in the classroom who just called it out for what it was. I mean, I remember once, because there was a question of whether a guy was going to get shanked or stabbed in the play, because in the play they killed his brother. And I was asking the class, I said, well, if you shank somebody, don't you know you could get another life bid? I mean, you're not going to escape. They're going to, and everybody goes, oh yeah, they know. And the end of class, one of the guys comes up and he goes, everything you heard is crap, because I shanked somebody in another prison. And let me tell you, I wasn't thinking about anything that. Only thing I was thinking about was taking the guy out. So, even within the prison classroom, there had to be checks like that.
Right. And let's move into, I had asked you earlier, and you referenced that you don't know whether you change their thinking. And I would, in researching this interview, I was revisiting an essay that Huey Newton wrote called "Prison Where Is Thy Victory," and in this essay, he identifies that how at some point in time, the contradiction between in the prison population becomes to the point where you have the illegitimate capitalists, those of us that's still striving to get a lot of money, although illegitimately, not saying that capitalism is legitimate, but he talk about prisoners becoming politicized and becoming political prisoners. In this process, did you see that type of transition? Because I know you say you deal with them when they're coming out and you maintain. Have you seen them take a step forward in terms of becoming more political and advocating for like the abolition of prison, or advocating for prisoners' rights, or advocating for more programs or more activities where prisoners can be able to write our story?
Yeah, well, first of all, the people that I deal with are pretty exceptional intellectuals who've turned their cells into libraries, who have read voraciously, who came out of failed school systems, but if they hadn't come out of failed school systems, would have excelled academically. They're older. I mean, most of the guys I teach are probably an average age in their 40s because they're in a medium security prison, but a lot of them started out at Trenton at the Supermax, and then after a decade, they get transferred. So I would say their political consciousness is pretty high, especially among the Muslims. I don't know what your experience is, but in the prisons that I've taught in New Jersey, and I think largely because of Malcolm X and other, they were probably the most politicized. I mean, I've taught 5 percenters and others. Of course, if you come in and you have a political consciousness, that's usually a ticket to Ag Seg. I mean,
pretty much, yeah.
Pretty quick, pretty right there. You don't have to commit any prison infraction.
Your thinking is valid enough.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's why, Ag Seg was created. It was for the
that's right.
It was created for them. So,
true that.
So, like, I taught a class where they had a sit-down strike. Well, of course, they found out who the leaders were. That's all they cared. Everybody's cell was strip searched. And those guys were sent to another prison and put in indefinite solitary confinement, like the Free Alabama movement. They used to call me. I haven't talked to them for a while on clandestine cell phones, but they're in indefinite solitary. So the goal is to isolate people with any kind of consciousness because prison authorities find that dangerous. They have to, like any. If you look at a manual, there are manuals held by slaveholders. Kenneth Stamp wrote a book on it called The Peculiar Institution. But because if you think about a plantation, 98% of people on there are enslaved people. So how do you divide them? Well, you've got people working the house, you've got drivers, but there's a whole method, and there are manuals that tell slaveholders how to keep an enslaved population divided against itself. And that's exactly how prison work. It's the same. So, you've got all my classes have informants. They call them snitches. We all know who they are. And if you got a prison uprising, they're always the first to get it, by the way, like the Lucasville prison uprising.
Yeah, that's right.
I had one guy, he was in the Black Liberation Army. I didn't teach him, but I know him, Audrey Latulo. And he wouldn't wear the prison uniform. He wouldn't even put it on. So,
right.
But on his tier, wherever the snitches were, their cells somehow got lit on fire until there weren't any more snitches. So they got all sorts of tricks to figure out this. Like if they got 3 people they think are snitches, they'll tell one of them there's a shank in the yard. They'll tell another one there's a shank under a table somewhere. They'll tell another one, and then they'll wait and see where the guards go. And then they know which one was the snitch. So, I mean, if there's any kind of unity within the prison, which we saw in Attica back in, what was Attica, 73?
70
was it? Yeah. Any kind of unity like that is dangerous. They have to keep them divided, and they have lots of dirty ways to do it.
Let's talk about our class and how was our class, because you say our class, trauma and the transformation in American prison. How was the prison transformed by our class?
Well, I would say in this way, it gave them a voice outside of those walls. So, like it was a 100-seat theater where the play ran for a month, but we had one night where it was just for the families. And about 5 minutes into the play, I heard, people beginning to sniffle, and then suddenly everybody just cried through the whole play. And it was making their voices heard and giving them dignity and respect and honoring their suffering. That was and it broke outside of those walls. It was interesting because we had to raise some money to help mount the play. So we did a friend of mine did I don't know what it's called, GoFundMe or something. Anyway, he kept saying all these donations, like $2, $4. Well, it turns out it was the families of my students who don't have any money, who were sending whatever they could to put this plan. I think that is the transformation. I think that there is transformation. There can be transformation. I don't want to be romantic about suffering, because a lot of suffering, you don't get transformed. You just get destroyed. I mean, let's be real about that. But transformation didn't come from me. It came from them. And I think that what I did by helping them write that play is not so much change what was inside of them, but allow others to see it and allow them to express it.
Right, and more importantly, you this whole process humanized these individuals, and I think Comrade George said that in the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, which we already know, like we recognize as a new plantation. He said that the goal is to destroy your individuality, to make you a collective entity, moving you in a herd manner, whereas though I don't have no identity, so therefore I don't have no voice. If I don't have no voice, I don't have no individuality, then I'm just a number. But I think my takeaway from this whole process was that you was able to give people that individuality, let people see them for who they are, and humanizing them, because like everybody go through something in society, but I think you referenced Michelle Alexander in either in the introduction, where it was talking about how it say like, well, we the most expendable class of people. Prisoners, you get the right to use us as the doormat. You got Chris, you got the last word on this. What do you want our listeners and our viewers to take away from our class?
I want them to see how remarkable these people are, and with what integrity they have and what brilliance they have, and how not just they and their families are hurt by the system, but we as a community are hurt. And we have to destroy the system. We have deindustrialized cities like Baltimore and Newark and everywhere else, and ruptured what sociologists would call social bonds. And so the forms of social control are militarized police who act as internal armies of occupation, and the prison system. That's why we have the largest prison system in the world. It's a moral responsibility for us to destroy it. And I think the mechanism by which we will destroy it is not by writing our Congress people who don't give a damn. They get money from the prison industrial complex. They're tools of the prison industrial complex. I think the hope is through strikes internally within the prison. There have been several, and those strikes have a core demand, which is that people have to be paid a fair wage, a minimum wage for the work. Remember, people are working 40 hours a week in a prison in New Jersey and making $22, and they don't have Social Security. But if we force the prison system to pay a living wage for the work that's done, and of course, under the 13th Amendment, prisoners are excluded from a living wage, then we can begin to cripple the system. But making appeals to conscience or, the people in power, I think is useless. I mean, that's what I get from people on the inside, that we have to support them. I mean, one of the Free Alabama people said, don't go to the State House to protest, go in front of the prison, especially when we're trying to carry out a strike. It is, I think, one of the most monstrous. We've done a lot of monstrous things in this empire, from Guantanamo to Iraq to everywhere else. But it's just monstrous what we do to our own. I mean, my students tell me after 6 days in solitary, they begin to go crazy, which is what solitary is designed to do. So if people we drive by these institutions, but we don't stop and investigate what's being done to our fellow citizens on the inside. And we all, those of us who are on the outside, I think have a moral responsibility to stop what's being done, because it's inhuman, it's cruel, and it's unjust.
There you have it, the real news about the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, a new form of slavery. The prisoners are the chattel, but in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all this degradation and inhumanity and dehumanization, the phoenix rose in the form of our class, where prisoners were able to unpack the traumatic events that took place in their lives and give context to these things and be able to heal at the same time. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this remarkable work that you have done on behalf of those of us that's disenfranchised and marginalized. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for doing it. I appreciate it.